Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Integral Life Podcast. My name is Keith Martin Smith. I am the author, most recently, of the book, When the Buddha Needs Therapy, which is about the integration of psychological shadow and spiritual awakening from an integral perspective. I'm also a developmental coach who specializes in transitions, and I also work with people on their books as a book coach and a ghostwriter. So it's great to be back here. The last talk I gave was on the 7 deadly sins of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that talk really got into the nuts and bolts, the sort of meat and potatoes of specific DEI policies and places where I thought they were either generating too much hypocrisy or paradox, or where they were not sufficiently robust enough to address the problems that they were trying to address. This talk is going to be much higher level, and I'm not really going to get into very many specifics. Really want to keep this focus on development and on perspective. So we're going to take sort of a higher level view and, run through what diversity, equity, and inclusion looks like from a developmental view, look at the levels around it and how it manifests through different worldviews. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. So let me give a little context here, which is, this talk really, there's enough vitriol and opinion and argument over diversity, equity, and inclusion right now. And so this talk is really to help us seek a way through, to give us a broader perspective on what's going on here. It's really important to remember that all of us, that all humans are bound by what we see and what we can't see. All of us, right? Me as much as everybody else. So reality is both infinite and empty. And as humans, we impose our meanings onto the world. Reality is just real. Right? It doesn't have meaning. We create meaning as human beings. The human realm is one of interpretation. It's not one of reality itself. It really can't be. And so all these things are perspectives, partial perspectives, some more partial than others. And this sort of sounds philosophical, but this really is foundational to a talk like this. So some of the assumptions underlying this talk. Most of you here are probably familiar with developmental theory, but I will try to give some context for any of you that don't know it well, or maybe don't know the integral model well, so it will still hopefully make sense. So developmental theory, basically, it's been around for about 80, 90 years, really was created by Piaget, Jean Piaget, the developmental genius who first figured out that children were not just small adults, but that they go through developmental stages. And he did a really good job of showing, they go from sort of magical thinking to concrete thinking to early formal operational thinking to formal operational thinking. And there's a lot of, reams of data that back that up. In the years since him, there have been 3 generations of additional theorists that have posited and done research on the idea that development continues or can continue past adolescence and early adulthood well into the whole of the human arc of human life. And it can continue in the same way that the Piaget levels unfold, transcending and including what came before. So the idea being that, like, as an adult, I have access to a magical world through my imagination. I don't just, when I go and develop into a concrete world as a young boy, I don't just stop being magical. I transcend that as my exclusive way of seeing the world and making meaning, but I include it as I continue to develop, and I have access to it. That's true all the way up the developmental ladder and all the way down. So we're going to really look at just 5 developmental stages here through this talk. The first one is, broadly speaking, ethnocentric, or what we would consider sort of a fundamentalist world of absolute rules. And I'll explain all these and unpack them as we go forward. From the ethnocentric or fundamentalist, we tend to differentiate and evolve out of that into early rational, which has some interesting differentiations from an ethnocentric point of view, but quite a few limitations as well, as all these worldviews do, including my own. From early rational, we go into mature rational. From mature rational, we go into post-rational. And post-rational is where a lot of the mature DEI insights and truths, partial truths, arise from. And then from the post-rational, we move to the post-post-rational, or the systemic, or the integral. And, that's really where this talk is coming from, right? So I'm looking at these other lenses, these other worldviews through which people impose meaning and interpretation on the infinite and empty arising that is reality. So one of the things I'll come back to again and again in this talk is this idea that these different worldviews can kind of see the world in basically sort of two ways that we're going to get into today. A concrete world that's based on my senses. The beginning of a subtle world that includes my emotions, my dreams, my imaginations, my thoughts about the future, and increasing subtlety inside of that subtle realm. So as we continue to evolve and develop, I can see more and more subtle objects. And I'll unpack what that means. But the most important point is that none of us are these levels, right? I'm not integral. A fundamentalist Christian isn't just ethnocentric. We are all over the developmental spectrum, sort of all the time. The research tends to say that it's very difficult for me to make meaning at a level above my highest level, but I will be all over the developmental map from the primary place where I see the world going down. So in other words, I have fundamentalist places where I come in, interact with the world. I have early rational places where I construe meaning, rational places, post-rational places, and post-post-rational places. So we want to hold all these things really loosely, very, very loosely. Okay. So with that said, let me give a very brief overview of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is. Now, this could be a talk in and of itself. And again, I would direct you back to my previous talk, The 7 Deadly Sins of DEI, if you really want to see a nuts and bolts discussion on specific policies. But broadly and generally defined, diversity, equity, and inclusion is a movement that sees a couple of things going on in the world. It sees systemic and systematic racism and sexism against people of color and women, as well as transgender people. The idea is that whites, and specifically white men, have sort of controlled the playing field and created the rules by which they get access to more of the goodies of culture. They are less prone to getting the downsides, from poverty to police brutality. There's more of an old boys network, which sort of promotes and encourages and rewards people who look like me. DEI maintains with a lot of accuracy that race, the idea of race, was created by whites, by white Europeans, really around the time of the settling of America, as it was noticed that slaves and Native Americans had concrete differences, physical concrete differences from white Europeans. And while an Irishman and an Englishman had been at war for a long time and hated each other, the Irishman and the Englishman both looked the same. And so this idea of race was like, well, Africans look different. Indians, Native Americans, but also Asian Indians also look different. And so this idea of race began to be, you have the white man, you have the red man, you have the yellow man, and you have the black man. These sort of 4 pillars of race began to be constructed. And as most of you probably know, race isn't real, right? It's a construct. It's something we impose on reality. Ask any geneticist or biologist, and race is a construct. It doesn't really exist. Okay, so it's one of those places where we impose our interpretation of reality onto reality. So DEI maintains that for people of color and for women, they have this forced association with racial or gendered groups, again, concretely. So if I'm a black man walking down the street, I am forced by the dominant culture I have a forced identification with my arbitrary racial group, which has important implications for me and impacts my capacity to operate as an individual. Because I have to deal as a black man with these biases and we could say cultural projections about what blackness may mean. So DEI also maintains that, as I said, power is controlled by primarily white men, that the system blinds us to itself. So it's the water in which white people swim. So it's very hard to see it, they would say. And they would say that me questioning the assumptions of DEI is really proof of my immersion in the system itself. Me objecting to it would be an example of either my white supremacy or my white fragility or both. And so there's very little openness to questioning the presumptions of what I just laid out. And I'm expected to actively fight the isms I see in the world, racism, sexism, right? That sort of stuff. DEI is also really founded primarily on the scaffolding of critical race theory, which is a theory. It's one of many types of theory that explains reality. But critical race theory really, in a nutshell, says that when there is a problem between the races, if you see that whites have more than blacks or men have more than women, the cause is always about power. The cause is not about choice. It's not about the free choice of women or the free choice of people of color. It's about power. And they would go so far as to say, even if women say are not choosing the science fields, the reason they're not choosing the science fields isn't actually because of their free choice. It's because of their internalized misogyny, their internalized patriarchy. So that's sort of DEI in a nutshell. Okay, it's a bit of a caricature, but I'm trying to be as nuanced as I can and move with some speed here. So DEI perspectives and principles, they originate from a postmodern point of view, unquestionably, but they will always be interpreted and enacted from multiple other stages of development as we watch them get socialized. So those principles I just spoke about will be interpreted and implemented from different developmental worldviews and perspectives. So let's take a look at what that looks like.